Welcome to today's meta lecture, which will be delivered by Noah Lenski, who is no unknown to the BCSS because he's a member of our advisory board, and we're very, 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 very glad to have you here today. He is also the Dunham Professor of Classics and Ancient History at Yale, currently on a tournée, one should say, in Europe. So we're very lucky that you could come by in Bonn as well. Noah did his PhD at Princeton, which resulted in his first book, The Failure of Empire, Valence and the Roman State in the 4th Century. Great book. After a longish stint at University of Colorado in Boulder, he has been in Yale since 2015. He's the author of several further monographs and edited volumes, including the equally great Constantine and the Cities, 2016, University of Pennsylvania Press. And he's the recipient of numerous awards, fellowships, and prizes, including a Humboldt Fellowship, which I believe has resulted in your spectacular German, which is really mind-blowing. And you're currently working on several projects, among which is also a translation of the Visigothic Code, which is a legal code, early medieval legal code. And I would think this has resulted in Noel's interest in cross-period, cross-regional slavery, because the Visigothic Code is a treasure trove about information on slavery in that particular region, so in early medieval Spain. And Noel is currently writing a book on slavery as a global phenomenon in the pre-modern world, which now we will get an aspect of, a global history of slavery in premodernity. So we're looking forward to your talk, and the floor is yours.
So, danke sehr, Julia. Und ich nutze die Gelegenheit auch, nur ein bisschen auf Deutsch zu sagen, und zwar, dass ich mehrmals in diesem Zimmer schon vorhanden war, indem ich vielmals an diesem Seminar teilgenommen habe, obwohl das erste Mal, als ich da bin, vor Ort persönlich, ist jetzt heute, und es ist wirklich sehr beeindruckend. Und ich bedanke mich ganz herzlich, also vor allen Dingen Julia, aber auch Jan und alle Teilnehmer, die so eine schöne und sehr wichtige System und auch Projekt am BCDSS so eingerichtet habt. And now I'll begin. To understand the practice of slavery in the Greek and Roman world, which is my specialty, previous scholarship has tended to look forward in time to the modern Atlantic world, where slaving practices were implemented on a wide geographical scale with virulent intensity and over a lengthy period from the early 16th to the late 19th centuries. The rich documentation these slaving systems generated is unprecedented in human history and preserves for us not just a record of the activities of enslavers, but also remarkably fully developed reactions on the part of the enslaved, such as slave narratives. The urge to learn from this material is fully understandable, and the insights ancient historians have gained from it into the practice of slavery in Greece and Rome has been invaluable. By the same token, the comparisons drawn between ancient and modern slaving systems have also had, let me put my reading glasses on, a distorting effect on our understanding of ancient Mediterranean slavery that has generally gone unremarked. This has occurred on at least 3 levels. First, comparisons with modern Atlantic slaving systems have pushed interpreters of ancient slavery to seek, and unsurprisingly to find, connections which may not be as strong as current interpreters have argued. Second, the focus on modern global capitalist slaving systems in the Atlantic world has left many avenues of inquiry unexplored or relegated them to the margins of the scholarship. And third, the assumption that Atlantic world slavery provides the most fertile ground for comparison has tended to foreclose forays into parallels from other times and places from world history. With this paper, I hope to begin shifting the focus of comparative ancient slavery studies away from modernity and toward premodernity, to look backward in history rather than forward, or at least not to focus our gaze on modernity at the expense of paying attention to premodernity in the effort to elucidate how and what ancient slaving entailed and how and why Greek and Roman slaveries may stand out in their premodern context. Let us begin by reminding ourselves that the practice of slaving, a term advocated by the late Joseph C. Miller after whom this lecture series is named, to which I then recur again and again, is a global historical problem. This is evident, for example, when we look at the wealth of emic words that can plausibly be translated with slave in languages from across the globe and across history. Here I offer only a tiny sampling. When each society approaches the problem of slavery as practice, however, they do so from their own perspective and with their own assumptions. That includes moderns who live in societies with no past record of slaving in their immediate cultural past, and others, like myself, for whose societies the practice of slavery forms part of the bedrock of social and economic formations. As I embark in this investigation, I therefore have to acknowledge my own positionality as an American, a white, and a male, all of which put me in arguably a less than ideal position to discuss this matter. I also acknowledge that I approach the problem as a historian of the Roman Empire, which helps to explain both why I chose to go into this somber subject in the first place and what I might hope to gain from comparative analysis. With these caveats having been issued, I'd like to turn the focus briefly to three premodern societies other than Rome or Greece, for whom slaving was a crucial element in their broader societal framework, beginning with the pre-Islamic nomadic Arab groups of the Syro-Arabian desert between the 4th and 7th centuries CE. These groups, whom our Roman and Greek sources term generically as Saraceni or Saracenoi, and our Syriac sources call them Tayaye, are relatively well attested, given that they came to play a significant role in the antique geopolitics already in the 4th century. They subsisted between three major global powers, the Roman Empire, the Persian Empire, and the South Arabian Kingdom of Himyar. The various and competing tribal and dynastic groups into which they were divided allied themselves with these superpowers as they moved through the desert by virtue of their skills as the only competent navigators of a vast inland sea. Across this space, they conducted a sort of desert triangle trade between Rome, Persia, and what is today Yemen. Through this space, they moved trade goods, including enslaved captives they took from the sedentarized peoples in the densely urbanized periphery of their forbidding ecosystem. These they sometimes sold or ransomed back by their families, but they could also retain their captives as enslaved persons for use within their own communities. To take just one example of the scale this captive taking could reach, I quote from the 6th century biography of John the Hesychast by Cyril of Scythopolis, describing the Japhnid Philarch Al-Mundir, who, after falling into conflict with Emperor Anastasius, punished the Roman Empire by sacking cities in Arabia and Palestine, carrying off captives by the tens of thousands. The native uses to which these were put included herding, leather working, and other manufacturing, services as domestics, and at times ritual immolation, especially to the morning star goddess, Abuza. Because enslaved humans were also self-moving property, they could be marched with relative ease across the desert Middle Passage to territories far from their homeland, then sold or exchanged on the active slave markets in each of the three empires on their periphery, or at times also ransomed. And as is common in societies, the practice captive taking Some enslaved persons were also incorporated into the captor society, especially those females locked into sexual relationships with their captors, such that a study of surviving pre-Islamic poetry reveals that in these sources, instances of marriage by capture might be accumulated to an indefinite extent from history and tradition. Moving across the Atlantic to circumstances later that nonetheless must still be considered pre-modern, a designation I only use over here, but am happy to discuss in the question and answer in more detail. I take us to the Amazon River Basin and the East Indian Piedmont of what is today Bolivia and Colombia. There, anthropologists, and especially Fernando Santos Granero, have identified extensive and persistent captive taking as central social elements of the Chiriguaná, a Tupi-Guarani-speaking people who were reported to have practiced regular raids on the neighboring Chane Arawak speakers on their eastern periphery. Invading at night, they would destroy villages, kill adult males, then take the surviving women and children to serve as enslaved persons in their own communities. Our 16th and 17th century sources indicate that the Chiriguaná villages included anywhere from 25 to 80% enslaved persons who were put to work as agricultural laborers, growing especially manioc, but also doing domestic chores and tasks with the labor-intensive job of producing manioc alcoholic beverages. These enslaved peoples were generally abused as uncivilized and worked to death, but some who assimilated could eventually be absorbed. Some 1,700 kilometers to the north, along the Valpes River, a tributary of the Amazon, lived the Tucano, who also engaged in captive taking and slaveholding of the marginalized Macu peoples into whose territory they had moved. Rather than replenish their slave supply through ongoing captive taking, the Tucano converted the Macu into a sort of helot class, forcing them to live on the periphery of their own villages and to do the majority of the hunting for those villages, which meant that the Macu became their main source of subsistence. The Tucano also employed the subservient Macu as menial laborers, or at times resold them, especially for firearms, to neighboring colonialists to serve as their slaves. As with Sparta's helots, the Macu were deliberately not integrated into Tucano society, but were instead kept as a permanent subservient class. These two New World examples, and these are only two of many such documented cases of captive taking and slaveholding in Native American societies, serve to remind us that captive taking and slaveholding are truly a global problem. Moving further east to Asia, I undertake to describe ancient and early medieval Chinese slaveholding, not an easy task, given that the vast majority of Chinese state structures over this period is truly immense. And the vast variety of ethnic and political groups we tend to cluster under the umbrella term Chinese is also immense. If we think, however, of the period between the rise of the Qin in 221 and the collapse of the Tang in 907 as a continuum of pre-modern imperial systems grouped under the Han cultural form, we can, I think, speak of slaving practices shared across these periods as contiguous and perhaps even unified. These were, of course, highly complex state systems with highly differentiated social structures. Yet in every period along this 1,300-year time span, we find slaves. These could derive from what anthropologists term intrusive sources, especially capture in war, but also the receipt of slaves by the emperor as tribute gifts, or by sale on the market, including an active international market that brought enslaved humans into the Chinese imperial space from its western and southern periphery. In addition, China also actively exploited slaves from intrusive sources by reducing its indigenous population to slavery, sometimes in ways that came to be outlawed, such as the unauthorized sale of children, or through self-sale on the part of the destitute, and through natural reproduction, for the children of enslaved persons were born into slavery, and especially through penal servitude, for the Chinese state regularly punished major crimes by a householder with execution for the perpetrator, but also the mass enslavement of his entire family because of their so-called collective liability, lian zhu fa. I offer on the slide a provision from the 7th century Tang Code, our first complete extant Chinese code, which orders the production of written documents for all slave sales and even requires a tacit warranty, much as the Romans did, for the sale of slaves. I also note that, as with the Roman environment, the Chinese state set a sales tax of 4%, which is really not very different from the Roman sales tax on slaves of 5%. But of course, the Chinese social system was very different from Rome's, involving, as it did, a 20-rank system of honor, tied up both with penal and with ritual practice. And rather than dividing the population into free and enslaved as the fundamental division among legal persons, Chinese law and custom divided them into good, yang, and base, jian, with slaves obviously falling into the latter group, along with numerous other ranks, including semi-dependent bondsmen. The fact that the state so regularly punished crime, which in the Chinese system was a vast category, with enslavement, and that penal enslavement involved enslavement to the emperor, in contrast with Roman servitus poenae, meant that another important division in Chinese slaving practice is that between private and public slaves, with the latter, the public slaves representing those enslaved to the emperor, usually for crimes, although the emperor could and did re-gift public slaves to private holders, thereby rendering them private. Within pre-modern Chinese economies, enslaved persons were put to all sorts of uses, serving as domestics, sexual partners, eunuchs, military fighters, manufacturing, mining, smelting, construction, and agricultural work, although this last, agricultural work, was not a major use for slaves in a region that was rich in population and had other structures for compelling agricultural labor from that populace. Some of these activities were characteristic of, or even exclusive to, penal, i.e. public slaves, who could number in the millions in some periods of imperial history. One thinks, for example, of the 700,000 convict slaves said to have constructed the palace complex of the first emperor of unified China. Some of these slaves were eventually assimilated into free culture, as, for example, those penal slaves whose terms were limited, and some private slaves could become free members of their households through concubinage or liberation on the death of an heirless householder. There were also various periods when the state sought to impose limitations on slaving, especially in the Tang period, when limitations were placed on the enslavement of Koreans and the Southern Yue, and during the equal field redistribution period of the Northern Wei, when enslaved people were essentially treated as householders. Slavery persisted in China into the 20th century, making it the longest continuously functioning slaving society in world history. So all this brings me to an ongoing debate about what we might mean by a slave society. I suspect that many of us gathered in this room have at some point been told that Rome and Greece were part of a rare and exclusive class of slave societies that set them apart as exemplary or even paradigmatic in slavery studies. This idea traces to the eminent 20th century historian M.I. Fenley, who, first in 1968, laid out the theory that all slaveholding societies can be divided into two buckets: slave societies and societies with slaves, where the former, whom he often clumped up with the sobriquet genuine, were characterized by the fact that, one, slaves constituted a significant percentage of the population, 20% or more; two, slaves played a significant role in surplus production for the elite; and three, slaves were important enough to exercise pervasive cultural influence. Finley posited further that only 5 societies in world history have qualified for membership in this dubious club of being genuine slave societies. Those were ancient Greece, ancient Rome, and modern Brazil, the Caribbean, and the US South. In my own book, co-edited with Kathy Cameron, I have argued that this binary, which in the meantime has served as a bedrock for slavery studies well outside the field of ancient history, should be abandoned. First, I argue it is fundamentally ethnocentric, which is to say Eurocentric, making the West the global leader, not only in modern imperial dominance and global economic hegemony, but also the masters of mastery, the best scoundrels. The fact is, however, that many societies besides Finley's canonical 5 fit this criteria as well, some of which I catalog in the What is the Slave Society book. By the way, none that I have treated here today are the ones that are discussed in that book. So this is just, there's plenty to talk about, as you all know, with BCTSS. Secondly, though, Finley's model is categorically imprecise. It is far too simple to account for the complexity of slaveholding practices globally, especially if one wishes not to simplify and to take U.S. South slavery as a sort of gold standard by which all other slave societies should be judged, which is something that Finley definitely does and that his adherents often do as well. As indicated, the debate is ongoing, with Walter Scheidel, for example, having published an article just 2 years ago defending Finley's model. Only last year, Daniel Padilla published a similar article. But there have also been voices equally opposed to the binary. So especially David Lewis, who has shown how many societies of the Eastern Mediterranean fit Finley's definition of the slave society alongside Greece, and Kostas Vlasopoulos, who has argued that the Finley model should simply be scrapped because it stands in the way of new progress in advancing our understanding of ancient slavery. Similar debates rage in the broader scholarship. One thinks, for example, of the hugely influential Slavery and Human Progress by David Bryan Davis, which portrays the global history of slavery as a history of Western slavery only, or the first volume of the Cambridge World History of Slavery, which appeared in 2011, and includes 1 chapter on the ancient Near East, 1 on Judaism, and 20 on ancient Greece and Rome. Yet at the same time Finley and Davis were writing, Orlando Patterson published his magisterial Slavery and Social Death, which took a truly global view of the history of slavery, using, as it does, 66 comparative societies. A similar approach was adapted in the introductory volume by Michael Zeuske, Sklaverei, eine Menschheitsgeschichte von der Steinzeit bis heute, and his Handbuch Geschichte der Sklaverei. This was answered in the French market by Paulin Isma, whose Les Mondes de l'Esclavage speaks to more than just modernity, but also premodernity. And also in Craig Perry's edited 2nd volume of the Cambridge World History of Slavery, which only came out 2 years ago and which treats the question in a truly global medieval context by offering 6 thematic chapters, 6 European, 8 Asian, 1 African, and 1 on the Americas. To be sure, the United States' own horrific history as a country, the slaving past, and the ongoing effects of our slaving past on the inequalities and the racialization evident throughout contemporary America have played a role in this debate, and rightly they should. My own efforts are not to deny the impact of American slavery and Western slavery on present history, nor to deny the role played by Greek and Roman slaving on the formation and perpetuation of slaving in the Atlantic world contexts. They are instead to attempt to not think teleologically about ancient Greek and Roman slavery, as if it was somehow the lone and embryonic form of pure or genuine slavery that would eventuate in the horrors of the Atlantic world. With this in mind, I turn back to premodern slaving in order to show how some of its principles recur across a variety of societies in ways that may well help inform our understanding of how early slaving systems functioned in ways different from what we associate with Atlantic world slaving, and especially U.S. South slavery. I will say up front that these are 3 of only a number of significant characteristics of pre-modern slavery that I hope to argue distinguish it from a modern slaving in a monograph that I am working on that Julia alluded to. Unfortunately, a monograph I'm working on along with too many other things, so it's coming slowly. So these principles that I'll talk about today, though, are that slavery is rooted in captivity, and pre-modern slavery never escapes that fundamental reality with consequences for the lives of enslavers and the enslaved. Second, that pre-modern slavery is tightly integrated into family structures, a fact which degrades family relations, but also offers potential for upgrading the slave condition. And thirdly, enslavers use the enslaved as instruments of power suited to their particular social/economic systems, which can include the generation of economic subsistence and or surplus, the amassing of social capital, and the enhancement of cosmic energy through ritual praxis. As to the first of these principles, captivity, evidence for the capture of humans by fellow humans is global and transcultural. While there are certainly cultures that avoid captive taking, there are no regions of the planet smaller than the size of a medium-sized modern nation state where captive taking has not been observed when archaeological or historical sources are available. This is true of small-scale societies like the Chiriwana and Tucano peoples that I discussed above, but also of larger state or proto-state societies. Here you see evidence from Central America in the 6th century CE with a Mayan warrior with arms bound behind his back, and a very similar figure from the handle of a fly whisk manufactured in the 2nd millennium BCE in Egypt. You can also see 3 examples of groups of enslaved persons bound at the neck being conducted in marching lines from the 2nd century CE tomb of the Somatemporos, the body seller Aulos Coprelios, which is in Amphipolis, another from the 12th century Khmer capital of Angkor Thom in modern Cambodia, and a third from the 6th century pyramid of the Moon, a Moche site in northern coastal Peru. Mass captive taking was thus a feature of global power assertion that netted human bodies for exploitation by enslavers according to their own cultural and economic norms. Because, however, this reality was accepted as a fact of pre-modern existence, attitudes toward captivity and reactions to it were conditioned along lines different from what we find in modern American or European sources. One thinks here, for example, of the famous Deerfield Massacre, the Deerfield Massacre in Western Massachusetts in 1704, when roughly 112 white colonists were captured by neighboring tribespeople, mostly Abenakis, who came to serve as a rallying cry that stoked anti-Indian sentiment and fed tensions that resulted in the 7 Years' War. The Romans, by contrast, for all that they found captive taking of their own people to be disturbing, treated it as a normal event and simply established legal procedures for the restoration of rights to any who managed to escape or be ransomed from enemy captivity, the so-called post-liminium. The environment created by this awareness of mutuality in captive taking can be well gauged from a law of 409 CE sent by the Roman emperor to the Praetorian prefect of the East to regulate what soldiers working on the Saracen frontier, the thing that we began with, to do with the captives that they had taken from their own raids on Saracen groups. So when Romans attack these Saracens, who often are dealing in slaves, and they confiscate the personnel that are associated with these Saracen groups, they're told, from confiscated spoils, he, the soldier, may take these back home on the condition that whatever persons are known to have been free or slaves, whom the enemy either carried off or will drive from their abodes in future, if such people have been able to be rescued in the meanwhile after the enemy was repulsed, they are by no means to be held under the pretext that they are pitiful plunder, but the power of a judge should assign free people back to their original birth condition and slaves to their masters. So there's an assumption that the Romans would take over these Saracen groups, and they would include some formerly free Romans, some formerly enslaved Romans, and then various Saracen peoples, and probably captives from other places, but that in those first 2 categories, if they had been free Romans, they needed to go free. And if they had been enslaved Romans, they needed to go back to their masters. And then all other people were open for the soldier to take as captives of his own. A judge was thus assigned responsibility for a sorting operation, which grouped a soldier's plundered Saracen slaves into 1, enslaved free Romans, who were to be set free, 2, enslaved Roman slaves who returned to their masters, and 3, enslaved Saracens and others who could be kept as slaves by the soldier. even if they too probably consisted of both native nomadic Arabs and other captives of nomadic Arabs taken from places outside Roman jurisdiction. In this environment, it goes without saying that there were no slaving zones of the sort that Geoffrey Finpole and Damian Pargas have defined as characteristic features of modern slaving systems. To be sure, these were a reality. These slaving zones were a reality of the Mediterranean of the late Middle Ages and following, and also of the Atlantic world, but not of premodernity. It was open season in the ancient greater Mediterranean. Turning to my second major point, that premodern slavery is tightly integrated into family structures, which in fact degrades family relations, but also offers the potential for upgrading the slave condition. I begin once again with the premodern phase I know best, that is the Roman. And here we must never lose sight of the fact that the Latin word familia, from which we get our word family, encompassed a much broader semantic range than our word family, whether in German or in English or in most modern West European languages. For it was limited neither to the modern Western nuclear family, nor even to the broader extended kin network so common in most parts of the world today. Instead, the Roman familia included the extended kin group of paterfamilias and materfamilias, and sons and daughters, grandsons, granddaughters, etc., but also enslaved persons of a household, as well as property owned by the broader family unit, and even slaves unified under a collective ownership. So things like the Romans talk about the familia caesaris, which is the slaves owned by the emperor, who kind of stands in for the state. And even though they're considered to belong to an individual, they're kind of a common property, but have their own family. They also have the familia publicanorum, that is slaves owned by corporations of public for the state. So they're not even owned by an individual, and yet they're considered part of a family. The Roman familia was, in other words, conceived of as a larger ownership unit, where all relations were governed by a quasi-property notion, with the inevitable result that family relations were degraded. Fathers could, at least in early and late Roman times, sell their children and even kill them, but also increase the potential for upgrading the slave condition, as we shall soon see. And while Roman family structures were by no means characteristic of all pre-modern societies, they did share with many other slaveholding societies the tendency to group slaves into the family unit, as happened, for example, in the Han Tong law, where slaves are considered household members in the same way that spouses and children were. As to the potential for upgrading the slave condition, we might begin once again with a Roman example, the frequent occurrence of marriage between male enslavers and former enslaved women. Here, we must never forget that essentially all of these relationships began as coercive or downright violent sexual encounters between dominant males and their enslaved females. But when the outcome was manumission and marriage with the opportunity to bear fully free Roman citizen children, this was certainly clearly some sort of upgrade for the enslaved person. Whether we can believe Marcianus when he tells us that a patron cannot take his freed woman as a wife without her consent, a principle that was almost certainly often observed in the breach, that is to say, people claimed that their former enslaved woman wished to marry them, but she maybe didn't and said she did, or didn't and said she didn't, but they still married her. Nonetheless, we do find a plethora of examples of what seem to be marriages that last, we'll say. I offer here CIL 69569, a funerary inscription to Gaius Caecilius, a doctor who had married his freed woman named Mostius, who then took his family name Caecilia. That's all we know of them. For an excellent study on such inscriptions, I invite you to read the article by Catherine Huemuller in the Journal of Roman Studies for 2020, which shows how fraught these seemingly happy stories could be. This records a funerary inscription of the 8-year-old child, Marcus Eunice Euphrosynus, and his freed woman wife, Acte, on which Acte's name has been erased, this sort of private damnatio memoriae. But on the reverse of the stone, we find not warm sentiments, but a curse against Acte, the former freed woman and then wife for having abandoned her aging husband for another lover and taking with her 2 of his slaves. We should never assume, in other words, that what I call upgrades were necessarily ameliorations of the lives of those freed women who attracted their master's affections. Yet we should also not deny that in these instances, as in many other captive-taking societies of premodernity, enslavement could and sometimes did represent a violent introduction into a new family, which could then embrace a person originally treated as enslaved, as if they were now a full-fledged member of the free family unit. And this pattern, the pattern of induction into the family for females via the sexual domination of the male enslaver, is so widespread across pre-modern cultures as to seem banal. This occurs in Mauryan India of the 3rd century CE, when the Kautilya Arthashastra tells us that, quote, a woman who bears the child of her owner should cease to be a slave on that account, along with her children and even siblings, if she looks after the household affairs. In Tang and Song China, perhaps also in Han, though we don't, to my knowledge, have evidence for it, enslaved sexual partners could be freed when they were pregnant and elevated to the status of concubines, which then allowed their offspring to be treated as potential heirs. A related practice was so common and regularized in ancient Near Eastern societies, it appears to represent a cross-cultural norm, whereby free women who were infertile due to natural or to ritual causes would allow their enslaved women to mate with their husbands in order to increase family fertility. Should the enslaved partner succeed in birthing a child, the enslaved and her child were then considered free. This practice can be found in the laws of Libet Ishtar and Hammurabi, but is most famously attested in the biblical examples of Sarai with Abraham and Hagar, of Rachel with Jacob and Bilhah, and Leah with Jacob and Zilpah. We've already seen the instance of the enslaved wives of pre-Islamic nomadic Arabs in late antiquity, and this continued after the coming of the Prophet. Islamic law, especially Sunni law, had firmly established rules concerning the al-Walad, mother of the child, who upon giving birth to her enslaver's child could not be sold, and upon her master's death was to be manumitted. This was obviously not the case with Atlantic world slavery. The most obvious case here being that of the U.S. South's enslaved woman, Sally Hemings, who happened to be the sexual partner and mother to the children of Thomas Jefferson, one of America's founding fathers. And though she was a long-time concubine of Jefferson and bore him at least 6 children, she was never manumitted by him, nor were her children ever recognized by Jefferson, a fact which largely went unacknowledged until the work of Annette Gordon Reed. We see much the same with the practice of manumission and adoption. Indeed, in Roman law, both adoption and the emancipation of children are based in legal rituals associated with the sale of one's children into bondage. So too, Roman freedmen, liberti, were considered members of their enslaving familia for their entire lives, a fact which added burdens to their post-manumission existence, but also afforded some securities, such as protection against destitution and the likelihood of a decent burial. We find similar practices in other pre-modern systems, as, for example, already in Neo-Sumerian law, the freed slave was termed a, quote, native son and considered to be the son of the man of the city to whom he had belonged. The newly discovered early Han-era legal materials discovered in Zhangjiashan, tomb 247, point in a related direction. When a householder died without a male heir, some of the slaves were to be manumitted and given his property, and with the most long-serving and trusted member of this household being chosen to take his place as the householder of that unit. So the enslaved members of this household become free and become a new household unit under the leadership of the former sort of chief slave of the house. The difference this represents in the outlook of enslavers toward their slaves in pre-modern versus modern circumstances becomes even clearer when we look at relative manumission rates between ancient and modern cultures. you will be aware that robust and reliable demographic information from antiquity is simply not available. Yet we can surmise something of the pattern, not just from the frequency with which we encounter manumission in ancient Greek and Roman sources, but also from quantitative analysis of the epigraphy, the inscriptions. Using this material, Henrik Morrison has shown that 30% of the cognomina attested in the Collegia inscriptions from Austria were Greek, which is a strong indicator of freedman status. So Roman inscriptions that give someone a Greek last name, or really first name, the last name in the order of Roman naming, often almost always indicate that that person was a freed person. And 71% of the names listed on the Herculaneum citizen list indicate freedman status. And Giuseppe Camodeca has shown that 41% of the cognomina from the corpus of wax tablets of Herculaneum indicate that these business people were freedmen. None of these should be taken as precise indicators of manumission rates, but collectively they indicate manumission rates in urban circumstances that must have exceeded 20 or even 30%. In the US South, by contrast, sorry, I didn't put that up yet. In the US South, by contrast, we learn that 2.3% of the documentation for legal slave transactions in the US state of Louisiana in the first 2 decades of the 19th century were manumissions, compared with 97.7% being slave sales. So there are very few documents for manumissions. And that figure grows a bit, but only to 6.5% per 100, 6.5% if we consider the years of Spanish Louisiana between 1770 and 1803. So the Spanish notoriously manumitted more people, but not nearly what the Romans did. Even in Rio de Janeiro in 1849, where our population records are solid, we learn that only 5% of the population consisted of freedmen. Here again, we should not take this divergence as cause for rejoicing in the humanitarianism of premodern slaving. It should, however, be understood to show the marked differences between ancient and modern slaving practices, not just in Rome, but cross-culturally. Slaving was not, it would seem, the monolithic practice we find in modern capitalist societies, but always remained a system most closely anchored to the social structures of the family. The final subject I will explore in this brief investigation is meant to broaden our understanding of the value associated with slaves, or rather, the value the enslaver sees in taking and holding another person in slavery. As stated earlier, I would argue that enslavers use the enslaved as instruments of power suited to their particular social/economic systems, which can include the generation of economic subsistence and or surplus, also the amassing of social capital, and the enhancement of cosmic energy through ritual practice. If we think in strictly economic terms, which much scholarship on modern slavery does, we can certainly find many parallels between pre-modern and modern slaving practices. In both worlds, slaves generally had what Karl Marx would call, both exchange value and use value. They could, in other words, be treated as human capital, bought and sold again and again in whatever form of marketplace existed in a particular environment. And they could be exchanged as gifts or recapitalized through ransoms. Slaves also, though, had use value, both through the benefits that they provided through the gratuitous exploitation of their labor power, but also through the social and even cosmic value that accrued to their possessors through them. We thus find pre-modern slaves serving a variety of functions, from primary producers of food, whether staples such as grain or manioc, or cash crops such as wine and olive oil in the ancient Mediterranean, or precious metals more broadly, or through animal husbandry, which often constituted the primary value economy for societies living on marginal land. They are known to have been used in manufacturing, but also in administration and tertiary economic activities such as banking, medicine, trade, shopkeeping, shipping. In fact, pre-modern slaving was, if anything, much more open to the human potential of the enslaved when one thinks about not just Greece and Rome, but also, for example, Old Babylon, where The 322 administrative letters studied by Seth Richardson indicate that the primary economic function of slaves had to do with information and credit in an economic environment of mercantilism. Premodern slavery was also, where there also sought value in enslaved persons through exchange. Here, the instances could be multiplied almost indefinitely from existing documentation and surmised where it is absent. To take just one example from another paper that I'm working on recently, I have learned from examining slave sale documents in late antique circumstances stretching from Cordoba in Spain to Turfan in the Tarim Basin that these share a crucial legal language indicating a cross-fertilization of slave trading practices across an arc some 7,500 kilometers in length, whether in Latin, Greek, Syriac, Bactrian, Gandhari, or Sogdian. These slave sales all use a phrase guaranteeing the buyer the right to, quote, do whatsoever you may wish to the slave, probably originally borrowed from Aramaic real property contracts that first appeared in Levant in the 1st century CE. This is something that perhaps Martin Schermeyer will be aware of. This is something I'd written into an article that he published in the volume he recently did with Julia Winnebeck, where I had thought perhaps this is a Germanic phenomenon. I'm interested in sort of resuscitating the idea of Germanic societies. But then I figured out that it absolutely wasn't. So at the last minute, I had to cut this section from that article, and he kindly did that because I discovered that this phrase occurs, as I say, over a 7,500 kilometer spread in contracts in about a 500-year period, and that it's really fascinating, and I look forward to getting back to that paper, maybe publishing it. There was thus an interconnected slave market all across this territory, essentially the Silk Road, that demonstrates a shared understanding that enslaved humans were to be treated as monetarily valued commodities whose benefits accrued to their owner regardless of their culture or language. We also see the way that the enslaved were employed to afford cultural capital to their possessors, which could be cultivated through social display. Slaveholders across pre-modern cultures made a point of being seen in public accompanied by their slaves. The larger their retinue size and the more differentiated its personnel and their trappings, the more kudos the enslaver expected to win. Moreover, it became crucial to employ enslaved bodies so as to extend the power of the master's own body, turning their slaves into a type of body double or proxy. But a good example of both phenomena, display and substitution, can be found in the realm of transportation, where, again, cross-culturally, we see masters cultivating their enslaved personnel to literally carry them on their own bodies, whether on a litter, as with this example of a Roman relief from Pompeii depicting a man being carried on a litter by 2 litter-bearing slaves, or in these 2 examples from North and South America showing chieftains being carried on the shoulders of male figures with who were almost certainly their slaves. In an East Asian environment, we find instead this example from Joseon, Korea, depicting a young Bon noble riding a donkey accompanied by 2 of his nobis, his slaves, or this example of a Tong era mural with an ox cart being led by an enslaved attendant. Perhaps the most disturbing example of this exploitation of the slave for the cultivation of power, for moderns at least, is the phenomenon of human sacrifice. This common occurrence stands miles apart from modern slaving, which focused on the labor value of slaves and thus had no use for their ritual annihilation. Yet it was common not just in societies regularly associated with human sacrifice, such as the Aztecs and Maya, but even in Roman society. Here we have to remember that, at least in its origins, gladiatorial combats were rituals meant to expiate the death spirits of those fallen in battle, and later the death spirits of anyone who happened to have died. Even if in imperial times gladiatorial spectacles then lost their overt connection to a funerary ritual, they continued to be produced on the occasion of ritual and religious festivals, and the spectacles at which they occurred continued to involve the seemingly needless performance of public executions of captive barbarians. This pursuit of ritual power, mixed with a desire to curry political favor through the public display of blood violence, constituted an important use for enslaved bodies that pulls Roman slaveholding much closer to pre-modern than modern ways of organizing slave labor. To take just two examples from elsewhere, the Moche peoples of northern Peru had long been known to have taken captives and even to have displayed gruesome combats in their remarkably veristic art, but there had never been evidence for the performance of human sacrifices until John Verano, at the Pyramid of the Moon, showed that the Moche engaged in regular captive-taking raids that resulted in large halls of enslaved male warriors who were then ritually killed, flayed, and dismembered in the plaza of this ritual complex. The precise meaning of these rituals is no longer accessible to us, but the pattern of captive sacrifice that they represent endured for some 600 years. And we also find evidence of human sacrifice in ancient China. This too has been demonstrated not so much through textual sources, which have only elusive references to the practice, but from archaeology. While human sacrifice had largely stopped by the Han era, they are now well documented in Neolithic and Bronze Age sites, such as the Shang era Henan site. So I close, though, with an example of how late they persisted in Europe, not in a Latinate context, but on the frontiers of 8th century Gaul, where we have a fascinating letter of Pope Gregory III attempting to forbid Christians in the city of Mainz, 150 kilometers south of here, from selling their slaves to pagan barbarians, likely Saxons, for fear that these would fall prey to human sacrifice. So he says, among other crimes committed in those parts, you have mentioned this, that certain of the faithful sell their slaves to the pagans for sacrifices, which thing, brother, we should think should be corrected, and we do not think you should allow it to proceed further, for it's a disgrace and an impiety. To those, therefore, who have done these things, you should mete out the same punishment as for homicide. Gregory's concerns reflect a world which looked radically different from the worlds of France, Britain, Spain, and Portugal, and the Netherlands that have given rise to modern Atlantic slaving worlds. And his concern with the ongoing problem of the use of slaves for human sacrifice represents not only one of the ways in which pre-modern society differed from ancient society in its practice of slaving, it's been my effort here to trace how some of these differences played out in the ancient Mediterranean context, but also then well beyond it. I hope not to have conveyed the impression that I believe in some sort of essentialist pre-modern slaving ideal type, or that all forms of pre-modern slavery form one thing. On the contrary, my effort has been to find patterns within a kaleidoscope of variety governed by levels of social organization, degrees of state formation, prevailing subsistence strategies, the development of technologies, ideological assumptions that support, but also at times throw into doubt slaving and slaveholding practices. Through this exercise, I hope to have shown that to understand slaving in the Greek and Roman worlds that I study, we would do well to think not just about modern parallels, indeed not primarily about modern parallels, and to turn instead to the global practice of slavery and enslavement in premodernity. Thanks very much.